Two white officers held her underwater for 39 seconds until someone screamed, "She's the sheriff's daughter!" That moment changed everything. What began as another act of racist policing exploded into national outrage and a town forced to face its truth. Who is Amara Delaney? And why did Riverpoint fall silent until it was almost too late? Watch the full story. Like, share, and subscribe for more untold truths that demand to be heard. The sun was high above Riverpoint, Georgia, unapologetic, golden, and hot enough to make the pavement shimmer. It was Juneteenth, and the town had come alive. Children dashed through sprinklers, music poured from food trucks, and the scent of fried catfish and kettle corn danced with the breeze. By the riverbank, families gathered with picnic baskets and pride. Red, black, and green flags flapped gently against the breeze. Freedom Day had never felt more festive. Until it didn't. Amara Delaney stood at the edge of the water, barefoot, her sandals hooked by one finger. She had just finished helping an elder carry chairs across the field and was on her way back to her family's tent when the shouting began. Two officers, both white, were weaving through the crowd with a purpose that felt out of place. Their posture wasn't protective, it was predatory. Their eyes locked on her as if she were prey. She noticed the way people stepped aside, not out of fear of her, but out of reverence for the badge. Even before she knew it was her they were targeting, her stomach twisted. A mother gathered her child closer. Someone whispered, "They're always looking for someone." Then, suddenly, "You! Stop right there!" Amara turned instinctively. Her heart pounded. She pointed to herself in disbelief, confused. "Me?" They didn't respond. They just charged. Sergeant Craig Blevins grabbed her by the wrist, twisting it upward behind her back, while Officer Ethan Ward pressed on her shoulder. She stumbled forward, crying out, "What are you doing? I didn't do anything!" The officers didn't explain, didn't read her rights, didn't identify themselves. To them, she matched a suspicious description, reported by an anonymous call, something about a young black woman acting erratic near the stage. But there had been no erratic behavior, just music, dancing, and joy. Still, in their eyes, she was dangerous because she was visible, because she was black, because she was unapologetically alive in a space where authorities still policed comfort by skin tone. They shoved her toward the edge of the river as people began to gather. Phones were raised, some recording, others trembling. A few murmured, but no one moved. No one stepped in. Amara screamed again. "I didn't do anything! You're hurting me!" She tried to turn toward the crowd, to make eye contact, to find someone, anyone, who would stop this. But then she felt the cold slap of water against her knees. Then her thighs. Then her chest. And then she was under. They didn't stop at the shore. Sergeant Blevins pushed her, both hands on her shoulders, into the river, shoving her head beneath the surface without hesitation. It wasn't a stumble. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. The water closed over her face like a tomb. Mud clouded her vision, her hair billowed like smoke, and her scream dissolved into silence. She fought to surface, but Officer Ward was standing on her calf, pinning her underwater. 39 seconds. That's how long she was held beneath. Long enough for her lungs to seize. Long enough to see faces peering down in horror. Long enough to know that her life was in the hands of men who didn't care if it ended there. She clawed upward, hands flailing, dress swirling around her like a broken flag. Her mind screamed what her mouth couldn't. This is how they kill us. Not with warning. Not with proof. Just with power. On land, the crowd grew. Some shouted, some moved forward, then stopped. A man called out, "Hey, she's not resisting." But no one truly intervened. Fear was a leash tight around the neck of every witness. And then it happened. From the far edge of the crowd, a teenage voice cut through the rising panic. Elijah Delaney, her younger brother, pushed past a woman holding a snow cone and screamed, "Get off her! That's the sheriff's daughter!" Time fractured. Officer Ward's grip loosened. Blevins paused mid-motion, water dripping from his arms. The words hit harder than a siren. The crowd gasped, not because Amara was human, or because she was drowning, but because of who her father was, Sheriff Samuel Delaney. In that moment, the officers saw not just a black woman, but a consequence. Their authority slipped, even if for a second, under the weight of a name they hadn't expected. They pulled her up abruptly, her body limp, her eyes wide with panic, mouth coughing river water. Her skin glistened in the sun, blue, then pink, then flushed with anger. Her legs gave out, and she crumpled to the grass as people finally rushed to her side. Paramedics appeared within minutes. Cameras continued to roll. But something had shifted in the air. She wasn't just another victim anymore. She was visible. The officers backed away as murmurs turned to accusations. "You could have killed her." "She didn't do anything." "That's attempted murder." Elijah kept recording. "Don't stop filming," he whispered to no one in particular. "Don't let them rewrite this." Amara's breathing slowed, but her spirit did not. Even lying there on the riverbank, shivering and soaked, she looked up at Blevins and Ward with an expression that wasn't fear. It was something deeper. Defiance. Disgust. And then came the moment that would be played again and again across the internet, the news, and community meetings nationwide. As officers were pulled aside and questioned by their own colleagues, a bystander leaned into frame and said, "You're gonna wish she wasn't the sheriff's daughter." Because now everyone's watching. The video hit 2 million views in 12 hours. Within 24, it reached national media. By 72, Riverpoint was no longer just a town with a festival. It was a town on trial, but it started with 39 seconds underwater. That's all it took to strip away the illusion of peace, to force the crowd to look inward, to ignite a reckoning that neither the badge nor the river could drown. So if you're watching this now, ask yourself, what would you have done in those 39 seconds? Would you have stood silent or stepped in? Like, share, subscribe, because this isn't just Amara's story, it's a mirror, and it's time we stop looking away. The moment Amara Delaney's face broke the water's surface, lips gasping, eyes wide with disbelief, a collective breath caught in the throat of Riverpoint. The sun was still shining, the music still faint in the background, but nothing felt the same. The water that glistened with summer light just seconds before now shimmered with shame. Her soaked body, crumpled on the muddy grass, was more than just a person pulled from the edge of death. She was a symbol, a mirror, a detonator. She coughed hard, deep, wrenching sounds that tore through the stunned silence. A paramedic leaned over her, shouting her name, pressing 2 fingers against her neck. "Pulse is weak but steady," he called. Another unrolled an oxygen mask, the hiss of compressed air slicing through the stillness. And then, almost too casually, almost like an afterthought, someone whispered the words that would shatter the day. "That's the sheriff's daughter." The phrase didn't shout, it echoed. It moved through the crowd like thunder behind glass, felt more than heard. It slid into ears and wrapped around spines. Some people blinked, unsure if they'd heard it right. Others gasped aloud, eyes darting between the officers and the girl they'd just watched nearly drown. And then, everything changed. Sergeant Craig Blevins stood stiffly near the water's edge, his boots sinking slightly into the wet soil. His knuckles were white around his belt. Officer Ethan Ward shifted uncomfortably, the heat on his neck no longer from the sun. They had handled her like she was disposable, an obstacle, a problem. But now she was Amara Delaney, daughter of Sheriff Samuel Delaney, the man who wore the badge they pretended to honor. Panic didn't explode. It seeped in, slow and suffocating. Blevins turned to Ward. "Did you hear that?" he muttered. Ward didn't respond. His eyes were locked on the crowd. The cell phones were still up, some shaking, others held steady like weapons. The record button glowed like a red eye of justice staring back at them. One woman, mid-40s, wearing a head wrap and holding her toddler on one hip, was streaming the aftermath live. "Yes, you're seeing this, right here in Riverpoint. She's the sheriff's daughter. And they did that to her." The words hit the internet like a match to dry timber. Within 15 minutes, the clip was on Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, captioned, stitched, and reposted with headlines like, "Sheriff's daughter nearly drowned by police on Juneteenth." "Georgia officers brutalize black woman. Didn't know her daddy was the sheriff." 39 seconds of horror. Now everyone knows her name. By the time Amara was loaded into the ambulance, her name was trending in 10 states. Inside the vehicle, her pulse fluttered beneath pale skin. Her mother, Lorraine Delaney, had arrived just as the doors closed. She ran alongside the ambulance for a few feet before it pulled away, her face stricken not only with maternal terror, but with a quiet, dawning realization. They hadn't spared Amara despite who she was. They hadn't recognized her. They hadn't cared. And that was the true sickness. Back at the riverbank, the officers were no longer in charge. Chief Darren Cole arrived less than 5 minutes later, his cruiser skidding to a stop near the food vendors. His face, always unreadable, was tighter than usual. As he stepped out of the vehicle, the crowd parted, but not in reverence, in recoil. He didn't even have to ask. The murmurs hit him before anyone else could. "They held her down, Chief. She almost didn't make it. That's Sam's baby girl. What are you going to do?" He saw Blevins and Ward standing like boys caught lighting firecrackers in a church. Eyes wide, lips pressed shut. As he approached, they straightened, but it was too late. "Get in the cruiser," Chief Cole said coldly. "Now." Blevins opened his mouth to protest, but the chief's glare was volcanic. "You're not speaking to me unless you have a lawyer present. That's not a suggestion." The weight of their error was finally pressing down on them, not because of remorse, but because of who Amara was. Because now the system they thought would protect them had a crack in it, and her name was carved in the center. At Riverpoint General, Sheriff Samuel Delaney stood over his daughter's hospital bed, trembling. He was a man who had spent 28 years walking the line between protector and politician. A black sheriff in a town where progress was more a performance than a principle. He had fought hard to earn respect in a system built to exclude him. And in doing so, he had made compromises. He'd ignored warnings, looked the other way at questionable practices, chosen silence when he should have chosen resistance. Now his daughter lay bruised, shaking, and struggling to speak. Now his silence had a price tag with his family's name on it. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and betrayal. Amara's eyes opened slowly, registering the machines before locking on her father. Her voice was hoarse. "You saw the footage?" "I did," Sheriff Delaney replied, his voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry." She blinked, one tear rolling sideways down her temple. "They didn't see me." He nodded, ashamed. "I know. No, I mean they didn't see me. They saw a problem. Not your daughter. Not a person." His chest tightened, every breath harder to draw than the last. And somewhere across town, inside the Riverpoint police precinct, someone hit send on an internal report detailing the incident, unaware that a junior officer had already leaked the body cam footage to the press. What followed was immediate and irreversible. By nightfall, the department's phone line was jammed. Civil rights attorneys from Atlanta were calling. National news anchors were requesting statements. Protest organizers were drafting flyers. And somewhere in the chaos, Riverpoint, once quiet, once proud, once comfortably ignorant, began to tremble under the weight of its own reflection. Because now the world was watching, and Amara Delaney, the girl they tried to drown, had a story the world refused to ignore. Sheriff Samuel Delaney had always believed in quiet reform. That change, real change, came not from protests or spotlights, but from steady hands behind closed doors. For 28 years, he had played the long game in Riverpoint, Georgia. He rose through the ranks not by shouting, but by knowing when to hold his tongue. He thought that being inside the system gave him the power to change it gently, from within. Now, sitting in a cold hospital room beside his bruised and battered daughter, that belief felt like a noose tightening around his legacy. Amara Delaney was alive, but barely. The doctors said she'd inhaled water, mud, fear, too much of everything. Her lungs would recover, they said, but her trust in the world might not. Sheriff Delaney hadn't known fear like this since the day she was born. Back then, her first breath had made him cry with joy. Now, her second chance at breath had made him cry with shame. She lay beneath a white hospital blanket, a tangle of IV lines and drying bruises. Her hair was still wet. Her eyes moved slowly, tracking the machines, the ceiling, and finally, him. When she looked at him, it wasn't the gaze of a daughter needing protection. It was the look of someone asking why the protector failed to act. Samuel's badge suddenly felt like a brand. He had given Riverpoint everything. He had kept his voice measured, even when officers whispered slurs in code. He'd smiled through tension, written polished statements, chaired diversity panels, all while swallowing the bile of compromise. And for what? So that two of his own men could try to drown his daughter in the river he once taught her to swim in? The door opened behind him with a soft creak. Lorraine, his wife and Amara's mother, stepped in. She didn't speak at first. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any reprimand. "You still think working from the inside's enough?" she finally asked, arms folded tight across her chest. Samuel's jaw clenched. "It's not that simple." "No, Sam, it is. It's always been simple. You just chose to make it complicated so you didn't have to burn anything down." He looked away, shame crawling up the back of his neck. "I thought I could protect her." She wasn't protected. Lorraine's voice cracked, raw. "She was nearly killed by men in your department. While you were off shaking hands and writing policy drafts, they were out there policing blackness like it was a crime." He said nothing, couldn't, because she was right. Outside the hospital, a storm was brewing. Reporters gathered on the lawn, wires running from their vans to cameras that blinked red with readiness. Protesters with signs had begun forming a semicircle around the entrance. Some read, "Justice for Amara." Others read, "Delaney, which side are you on?" And still others simply said, 39 seconds. The footage had already gone global. From Riverpoint to D.C. to Johannesburg, people watched a young woman nearly drown while officers ignored her pleas. But what made the world stop wasn't just the brutality. It was the name they learned at the end of the clip. "That's the sheriff's daughter." The irony was too brutal to ignore. The very system Sheriff Delaney upheld had turned on his own child, and he was now a symbol of the hypocrisy he had tried so hard to avoid. Journalists didn't want his statements. They wanted his soul. His silence over the years had once made him appear composed. Now It looked like complicity. Back at the precinct, things weren't any quieter. Inside his office, Deputy Chief Trudy Banks waited, arms folded, a legal pad full of names and timelines in front of her. She was one of the few who'd stood beside him when he first took office, and her loyalty now trembled under the weight of reality. "We've got a problem," she said, voice low, "and you know it's not just optics." He nodded slowly. "They're calling for suspensions? They're calling for resignations. Blevins, Ward, and—" She paused. "You." The word hit like a blunt object. "I didn't drown my daughter," he said quietly. "No, but you built the department that made it possible. And right now, people think your silence gave them permission." Samuel leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked under his weight, or maybe under the years he'd spent denying this day would ever come. On the wall behind him, plaques and photographs of community awards suddenly felt hollow. His office, once a sanctuary of accomplishment, now smelled like betrayal. Trudy placed the legal pad on his desk. "I'm not here to throw you under the bus, Sam," she added. "But we don't get to hide from this. Either we lead the change, or we are the problem." He looked at the list. Names, ranks, incident reports. One line stood out, underlined in red. "Refused to activate body cam until suspect was already submerged." Samuel's stomach turned. He rose from his chair and looked out the window. Down on the sidewalk, someone held a sign that read, "Your badge doesn't clean blood." The people who once waved to him at the farmer's market now glared through car windows. The officers he once defended in closed-door meetings avoided his eye in the hallway. Amara was lying in a hospital bed. The world was demanding justice. And the only person who could no longer afford silence was him. He had to choose, protect the badge or confront what it had become. He turned back to Trudy. His voice was calm, but no longer soft. "Call a press conference. I'll speak tonight." She blinked. "Are you sure? I'm done hiding behind protocol. They wanted my loyalty. Now they'll have to face my truth." As the sun set over Riverpoint, the storm gathered speed. Sheriff Samuel Delaney stood at a crossroads where every step forward might cost him allies, power, reputation, even the badge itself. But as he looked at the empty chair beside his daughter's bed, the decision became clear. The system he helped protect had just tried to bury his child. Now he would help bury the system. The microphone stood taller than she did, a black foam tip, like the muzzle of a weapon, aimed directly at her trembling mouth. Dozens of flashing cameras lined the front row of folding chairs, and behind them, national media trucks, boom mics, tripods, live streams, and a sea of wide eyes waiting to hear what the girl from the river would say. Amara Delaney adjusted the sleeves of her blue cotton shirt, the one her mother said made her look strong. Her voice hadn't fully healed, her ribs still ached, and every breath she took carried the weight of 39 seconds underwater. But today her silence would end. Behind her, Sheriff Samuel Delaney sat off to the side, his hands clasped in his lap, no badge on his chest. His hat, normally perched squarely with pride, sat forgotten beneath his chair. The town square was packed. Journalists elbowed one another, activists held signs, students huddled in silent solidarity. Lorraine Delaney stood just to Amara's left, hand resting firmly on her daughter's shoulder until the final second, when Amara stepped forward and leaned in to speak. No script, no teleprompter, just memory and fire. Her voice cracked on the first word, but she didn't flinch. I couldn't breathe. A hush rippled across the crowd like wind through wheat. She paused, inhaling deeply, forcing the air into her bruised lungs, not because of the water, but because when they looked at me, they didn't see a person. They saw a threat. Flashbulbs popped. Somewhere in the crowd, someone gasped. A cameraman muttered, "Jesus." and all across Riverpoint, on porches, in police cruisers, in classrooms. The truth crashed like a flood. Amara Delaney had spoken. Her words weren't poetic. They were raw, surgical. Each syllable peeled back the layers of denial this town had wrapped itself in for decades. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply stood there, small, calm, and unshakably alive, and told them what happened. I was walking to my family's tent. I wasn't running. I wasn't yelling. I wasn't resisting. I was just there. And for them, that was enough. They didn't ask my name. They didn't tell me why they were grabbing me. They didn't care that I begged them to stop. They didn't see a daughter, or a student, or a human being. They saw someone who didn't belong in their idea of safety, so they tried to erase me from it. She lifted her hand, the bruises on her wrist still faintly visible beneath the makeup. A symbolic gesture, and every lens in the square captured it. When they pushed me under, I thought, this is how it happens. Not in the middle of the night, not on a deserted road, but here, at a festival, in broad daylight, in front of everyone. And still, nobody stopped them. Silence fell so heavy it became a presence. Even the birds stopped chirping. From somewhere in the crowd, a voice broke through. "We see you now, Amara." She turned toward it, her chin lifting just slightly. Not in pride, in purpose. Seeing me now won't undo what happened, but it can decide what happens next. The moment was electric. By nightfall, her words had been clipped, posted, subtitled, and shared. CNN called her a voice of generational reckoning. MSNBC's headline read, "She couldn't breathe. Now America can't look away." TikTok stitched her clip with protest chants, art, spoken word tributes. Her name trended across 3 platforms in less than 2 hours. But Amara wasn't interested in fame. She was interested in impact. Riverpoint, however, was splitting at the seams. Old-timers who once cheered for the sheriff at parades now argued in diners. Teachers debated policy in break rooms. Pastors rewrote Sunday sermons. The Riverpoint PTA held an emergency session to discuss community healing. But Amara's peers didn't want healing without accountability. The protests began the very next morning. It started with 3 girls from the high school marching silently down Oak Street, holding signs that read 39 seconds and "She couldn't breathe." By lunchtime, they were joined by students from the community college, retired veterans, local shop owners, and a group of pastors led by Reverend Josiah Delaney, Amara's uncle, who carried a handwritten banner that read, "Justice is not a whisper, it is a flood." By the end of the day, there were over 300 people marching through Riverpoint. The following week, over 1,000. The mayor tried to calm tensions, calling the protests understandable but disruptive. Amara responded with a video filmed from her bedroom. "Disruption is the point. If the system had been working, I wouldn't be recovering from being drowned." That clip hit 2.4 million views in 24 hours. Media tents lined Main Street. National figures began arriving. Lawyers, civil rights leaders, and representatives from organizations that once passed Riverpoint by. But they weren't the movement. Amara was. And she wasn't alone. Her speech had activated something deeper than outrage. It had pierced the illusion that Riverpoint was better than all that. For years, the town told itself that racism was a thing of the past, or at least something that happened elsewhere. But Amara's testimony turned that illusion to dust. Inside homes, parents wrestled with what to tell their children. Inside classrooms, students refused to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. Inside the precinct, officers whispered behind closed doors, unsure who would be next to fall under the microscope. Some defended the system. Others, for the first time, questioned it. And through it all, Amara kept speaking. She was invited to schools, churches, Community forums. She spoke in libraries and under open skies, sometimes with a microphone, sometimes with just her voice and a circle of folding chairs. She told people not only what happened to her, but why it kept happening to others. She reminded them that silence was not neutral, and that visibility without action was just another kind of erasure. And she always ended with the same words. They tried to drown me, but they forgot. I know how to rise. As Riverpoint roared with voices that had once been silenced, Amara Delaney emerged not just as a survivor, but as a force. A generation's voice in human form. Not loud by nature, but clear by conviction. What began as 39 seconds beneath a river became a movement built on breath, truth, and unrelenting purpose. And the town that once turned away? Now it had no choice but to listen. Riverpoint had always been a town of quiet rituals and polite avoidance. A place where porch lights flickered at the same hour every night, and where difficult conversations got swallowed by sweet tea and silence. But ever since Amara Delaney stood at that podium and told the world what happened, the hush had been broken, and it wasn't coming back. Now, each street corner hummed with tension. Every passing glance, every church sermon, every PTA meeting came weighted with the same unspoken question. Whose side are you on? Signs appeared in windows. Some read, "Support our police," in bold blue block letters. Others were hand-painted on cardboard and duct-taped to screen doors. 39 seconds. A lifetime of injustice. Pickup trucks drove through town with flags flapping. Some stars and stripes, others the now infamous thin blue line. On the same street, just 2 houses apart, neighbors who once borrowed each other's sugar now crossed the road to avoid eye contact. The air itself had shifted. Something raw had been pulled from beneath Riverpoint's polished image. Something uncomfortable. And nobody could put it back. One Saturday morning, less than 2 weeks after Amara's press conference, Sheriff Samuel Delaney stepped out of his house and found a message burned into his lawn in bleach. You chose them. No signature. No name. Just those 3 words, eating away at the grass like acid. His badge sat inside a drawer now, untouched. His resignation hadn't stopped the noise. In fact, it seemed to make it worse. Some called him a coward. Others called him a traitor. Even more called him a mirror, finally forced to face what he'd spent years ignoring. At the heart of the storm was Amara. But the fire spread far beyond her. Her mother, Lorraine Delaney, never meant to be a movement leader. She was a librarian, a lover of quiet corners and whispered wisdom. But when she saw her daughter pulled from the river, face swollen, voice shattered, something inside her broke, then rebuilt stronger. With Reverend Josiah, Amara's uncle, she began organizing candlelight vigils in the park. The first one drew 60 people. The second, nearly 200. They lit candles for names no one wanted to say out loud, names buried in news stories and memory, names like Tamika Jefferson, Marcus Hill, Devin Reeves, all black, all brutalized in or near Riverpoint's jurisdiction in the past 10 years. No charges ever filed. Until now, their stories had been dismissed, misunderstood, ignored. But now, standing under flickering flames, they were spoken like scripture. Lorraine didn't shout. She didn't rage. She stood tall and read the names like a lullaby for the forgotten. People wept. People clenched fists. People who had once believed Riverpoint was better than all that finally realized Riverpoint was exactly that. Meanwhile, Reverend Josiah turned his Sunday sermons into full-blown calls to action. Jesus turned tables. Why shouldn't we? He preached one morning to a packed church. This town has praised law and order while burying bodies in silence. We will not be complicit in that graveyard any longer. His words lit up on social media. Young people posted clips with captions like "Revolution in Riverpoint" and "Pastor with no chill." Teenagers began organizing protests, walkouts, marches, even teach-ins at the community college. Every Friday, they held open mic nights in the town square, reading poetry, sharing testimonies, and singing songs once reserved for rallies in bigger cities. It wasn't just a protest anymore. It was a reckoning. But not everyone welcomed it. Local businesses complained that the protests were scaring customers away. School board members worried about political disruption in the classroom. And a group of retired officers launched a counter-movement called Protect the Badge, hosting meetings in fire halls and diner booths, calling the youth manipulated, Amara dramatic, and the river incident an overreaction gone viral. It all came to a head one muggy Thursday evening, inside the town's municipal building, where a community town hall was held under the wary eye of 4 armed security guards and 24 restless souls. The room buzzed with anxiety. Folding chairs creaked beneath old wounds and rising tempers. On one side, residents wearing pins with blue stripes. On the other, young people in T-shirts with Amara's face, framed by the words, "39 seconds too long." Sheriff Delaney sat quietly in the back. Lorraine was front row, pen and notepad in hand. Reverend Josiah stood beside her. Amara, though invited, chose not to attend. Not because she was afraid, but because she knew the space wouldn't listen until her absence became its weight. One by one, townspeople approached the microphone. Some offered support. "What happened to that girl was wrong," said an elderly woman, voice trembling. "You can't look at that video and say otherwise." Others defended the officers. "They were doing their job," a man insisted. "This whole thing's been blown out of proportion. You're tearing our town apart." Then came the voice that pierced it all. A teenage girl, maybe 16, with braids and a trembling hand, stepped up to the mic. Her voice was shaky but fierce. If it wasn't the sheriff's daughter, she'd be dead. The room exploded. Chairs shifted. A few gasped. One man stood up, shouting, "How dare you!" But the girl didn't move. She gripped the microphone with both hands, eyes locked on the front row. "You all know it's true. If she hadn't had a name this town recognized, they would have buried her in excuses like they've done to every other black kid who fit a description." Nobody could argue, because she wasn't wrong, and in that moment, the town hall wasn't just a building, it was a courtroom. And Riverpoint, as a collective, was on trial. The question wasn't whether injustice had occurred. That had already been answered. The real question was what the town would do now that it couldn't look away. Would it protect the uniforms at the cost of its own integrity? Or would it finally admit the truth long buried beneath its polite traditions? Lorraine stood slowly and applauded. One by one, others followed. The teen returned to her seat, tears brimming in her eyes but pride lighting her face. And somewhere, just outside the municipal building, someone hung a new banner from the front steps. "Riverpoint, choose your reflection." The town was no longer divided between silence and noise. It was divided between those who wanted to move forward and those terrified of leaving the past behind. And in the days that followed, it became clear. This wasn't just about one girl and one river. This was about who Riverpoint wanted to be, and whether it had the courage to become it. It began as a whisper in a precinct hallway, low, urgent, and quickly hushed. A junior IT technician named Marcus Hill had stumbled across a folder mislabeled as Training Review, buried beneath outdated policy files on the department's cloud server. Inside, he found 2 uncut body cam videos, each over 4 minutes long, raw, and unsanitized. They captured what no press conference had touched, no official report had acknowledged. The laughter, the cruelty, and the terrifying calm with which Sergeant Craig Blevins and Officer Ethan Ward held Amara Delaney beneath the water. In the footage, the officers don't look afraid. They look bored. "She squirmed like a cat in a tub," Blevins said, chuckling, as Ward wiped sweat from his brow. "Maybe next time she'll think twice before matching a damn description," Ward muttered. They were speaking after the fact, just off the riverbank, shirts damp, hands on their hips, still wearing their body cams, apparently forgetting, or simply not caring, that the cameras were still rolling. One clip shows Amara sobbing into the grass, paramedics kneeling beside her. Ward turns to Blevins and says under his breath, "All this drama for some sheriff's brat. What's the worst that'll happen? Desk duty? That clip leaked on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday night, it had been seen over 4.6 million times. There were no more sides in Riverpoint. There was only truth, and the wall cracking beneath it. The footage wasn't blurry. It wasn't disputed. It wasn't hypothetical. It was evidence, clear as day, undeniable as thunder, and it tore through Riverpoint like a hurricane. Within hours, desk duty trended on Twitter. Activists posted side-by-side images of Amara's bruised face and the officers' smirking expressions. Hashtags like "Drown the Badge" and "Eco Culture Not Accident" surged. Even some who had previously defended the officers went quiet. Because this wasn't adrenaline. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was mockery. This was habit. That same night, Chief Darren Cole sat alone in his office, the blue tint of his computer screen lighting the worry on his face. He had seen the footage. Twice. The first time as a leader. The second as a father. And both times, he'd felt the shame settle into his bones. Darren Cole had once believed in the brotherhood of the badge. He had made it through the ranks as a black man in a southern precinct by balancing conviction with caution. He believed that slow change was safer change. But tonight, watching Ward joke as Amara gasped for air in the background, he understood the terrible truth. He'd been trying to reform a culture that didn't think it needed saving. The next morning, Cole called an emergency press conference. He stood on the precinct steps, not flanked by fellow officers, not behind a podium, but alone, holding a single piece of paper. Reporters surrounded him like bees on sugar. His voice, when it came, was flat but steady. The leaked footage is real. It was recorded the same day Amara Delaney was assaulted. What you heard is what we heard. He paused. The cameras leaned in. This isn't just about two bad cops. This is a culture that jokes about force, that treats civilians like objects, that believes the badge is above the breath of a human being. There was a sharp intake of breath across the crowd. No one had expected him to say it. Not like that. Not honestly. And I won't pretend any longer. Because silence, especially from leadership, is what makes this possible. The weight of his words sank into the pavement, into the cameras, into the consciousness of a town finally forced to confront itself. Chief Cole announced the immediate suspension of both Blevins and Ward, pending criminal investigation. But he didn't stop there. He called for a full-scale independent audit of the entire Riverpoint Police Department. 10 years' worth of complaints, body cam footage, arrest records, and training protocols. Effective immediately, he said. An external review board will take over all internal affairs investigations until further notice. The room exploded in questions, but Cole turned and walked away. Riverpoint was no longer just a town in crisis. It was a precinct under siege. The emergency investigation launched within 48 hours. The Department of Justice sent representatives from Atlanta. Civil rights attorneys pounced. Former officers began speaking anonymously to local press. One retired sergeant confessed, "That river wasn't the first time. It was just the first time anyone cared enough to film it." Public hearings were scheduled. Protesters outside the precinct were joined by former victims of police misconduct. One man, Marvin Trotter, held up a printout of a dismissed complaint from 2016. They slammed my head on my steering wheel because I flinched. I told them I couldn't breathe either. I got fined. They got a promotion. Within a week, more than 24 complaints were reopened, some dating back as far as 2012. What had been defended as isolated incidents now formed a pattern as clear as the river that nearly became Amara's grave. But not all officers stood behind the blue wall. Detective Cheryl Vasquez, a 15-year veteran and one of the few women of color on the force, gave a quiet interview to a local reporter. We're told not to speak, that if we challenge behavior, we're disloyal. But loyalty to what? A culture of silence? I didn't become a cop to protect cowards. I became one to protect people. And that includes Amara Delaney. Her words spread like wildfire, too. Soon, a wave of resignations hit the department. Not just the accused, but those who feared the audit, those who'd looked away for too long, and those who knew the tide had turned. Chief Cole remained in place, but no longer as a protector of the system. Now, he was its undertaker, and its rebuilder. In homes across Riverpoint, families watched the news in silence. Teenagers replayed the leaked footage on their phones with clenched jaws. Elders wept, not out of surprise, but from long-held grief finally made public. And Amara? She watched it all from the corner of her living room, legs pulled to her chest, her phone buzzing every few seconds with messages from strangers. Thank you. I believe you. I'm sorry it took this long. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt hollow and wide open, but she also felt something else rising beneath the ache. Vindication. The lie was dead. The blue wall had cracked, and there, in the light pouring through, Riverpoint saw itself for the first time. The courthouse in Riverpoint had never seen anything like it. Lines stretched around the block before sunrise. News vans idled in every parking lot for 6 blocks. Protesters, supporters, skeptics, and survivors, thousands of them, stood shoulder to shoulder, signs raised high above their heads, chanting, praying, weeping, waiting. Inside, the walls of the courtroom seemed to pulse with tension, each wooden bench creaking under the weight of a town and a nation on edge. Sergeant Craig Blevins and Officer Ethan Ward sat side by side at the defense table, their uniforms traded for stiff gray suits. Their faces were tight, unreadable, though not because of remorse, because of the spotlight. They had been charged with assault with intent to cause bodily harm and attempted murder, and now the full force of public judgment bore down on them like floodlight through glass. Judge Miriam Fields presided with a grave steadiness. She knew what this case meant, not just for Riverpoint, not just for Amara, but for every courtroom where truth had been smothered under silence, where evidence drowned in reasonable doubt, where uniforms were treated as armor against accountability. The prosecution's case was swift, surgical, and unrelenting. The body cam footage played on 3 large monitors, unedited, uncensored, unbearable. Every gasp, every gurgled plea from Amara, every smirk, every word. She squirmed like a cat in a tub. What's the worst that'll happen? Desk duty? You could feel the jury's stomachs turn as those words echoed through the chamber. One juror, an older woman in a green sweater, reached for a tissue when the footage cut. A young man on the back row kept his jaw clenched so hard it trembled. Witnesses followed. Paramedics, bystanders, experts in use of force protocol. But the day everyone held their breath for was Amara's. She entered the courtroom quietly, walking slowly, deliberately. She wore black slacks and a soft cream blouse, her hair pulled back, her posture precise. She wasn't dressed for drama. She was dressed like someone telling the truth. As she stepped into the witness box, the room stilled. Every phone went down. Every pen paused. And then she spoke. Her voice was even, her tone restrained, but each word cut like broken glass. They tried to drown me. Silence. You could hear the whir of the air conditioning above them, the faint click of the judge's pen. But it wasn't just them. It was the people who watched and said nothing. The people who called it standard procedure. The people who raised me to believe my life mattered, and then walked away when that belief was tested. She looked directly at the jury. It was your silence that nearly killed me. That sentence broke something open. 2 jurors cried. Reporters shifted uneasily. One officer seated in the gallery lowered his head into his hands. Amara continued, her voice unwavering. She described the moment her lungs filled with river water. The panic, the rage, the knowing that her life could end not with gunfire, but with dismissal. They never asked my name, not until someone screamed who I was. Only then did I become real to them. Only then did I matter. And I think about that every day. The defense cross-examined her gently. Too gently, some thought. They knew better than to challenge her too hard in front of a nation watching. But they still tried to reframe it. Were the officers scared? Was it a chaotic scene? Could it have been a misunderstanding? Amara didn't blink. Fear is not an excuse for violence. Chaos doesn't explain cruelty, and misunderstandings don't come with body cam laughter. She stepped down from the witness stand with her head high. She didn't look back at Blevins or Ward. She didn't have to. The entire courtroom had already seen them for what they were. Not just officers who acted recklessly, but symbols of a system that had always excused recklessness when it wore a badge. The defense presented their case. It was thin, desperate. Character witnesses spoke about years of loyal service, decorations, community contributions. But none of it could undo what had been recorded, what had been said, what had been done. The closing arguments came on the 6th day. The prosecution stood before the jury, gesturing to the empty witness stand. She lived to tell you her truth, but so many others haven't. This case isn't about public image. It's about public trust. If 2 armed men can laugh about nearly killing an unarmed woman and face no consequence, then what hope does justice have? Outside, thousands gathered with candles and silence. Inside, the jury retreated. 7 hours later, they returned. The courtroom went breathless. We, the jury, find the defendants guilty of assault with intent to cause bodily harm. Guilty of attempted murder. Gasps, cries, cheers, a deep exhale from the entire gallery. Blevins blinked rapidly. Ward stared straight ahead. But it wasn't about them anymore. It was about Amara, standing in the aisle with her hand over her heart, tears sliding down her cheeks. Not from victory, but from validation. From knowing that, for once, the system had listened. That her story wouldn't be reworded, reframed, or rewritten. Across the nation, headlines lit up. Justice for Amara. Guilty verdict rocks. Georgia police culture. Courtroom shock. Officers convicted in historic Riverpoint case. It was your silence that nearly killed me. Survivor's testimony stuns jury. But even more than news cycles, something deeper shifted. Conversations changed. Communities opened. Other survivors began to speak. Other departments launched their own internal reviews. And in Riverpoint, where 39 seconds had once nearly stolen a life, the courtroom had become a birthplace of transformation. Amara left the courthouse quietly, walking past a crowd of supporters who whispered prayers and thank yous. She nodded, humbled, tired, but present. Not just a symbol, a survivor. A teen in the crowd handed her a handmade sign. It read, "You didn't drown, you rose, and we rise with you." And for the first time in weeks, Amara smiled. The verdict cracked open more than just a courtroom. It tore through the very foundation of Riverpoint's law enforcement. Within 48 hours of Blevins and Ward being found guilty, 3 senior officers resigned. 2 more were placed under immediate review. Desks were emptied, badges handed in, files seized. The sheriff's office, once a fortress of tight-lipped tradition and quiet impunity, now stood hollow, gutted from the inside out. Its silence replaced by the buzz of reporters, community observers, and independent auditors poring over every dusty drawer and sealed envelope. Sheriff Samuel Delaney's resignation came in the form of a simple letter. 5 sentences long, handwritten, delivered in person to the city council. No press conference, no cameras, just pen and paper and truth. I failed to see what was in front of me. I failed to stop what I should have dismantled years ago. I am stepping down, not out of defeat, but out of duty. This department needs rebuilding, and it can't happen under the shadow of my silence. Sincerely, Samuel Delaney. But even as he walked away from the badge he once believed could shield the town, something unexpected happened. That same afternoon, Lorraine Delaney posted a photo online. Samuel, in jeans and a t-shirt, sitting at their kitchen table surrounded by a small group of community leaders, notebooks open, coffee mugs scattered, his hands gesturing mid-idea. The caption read, "The badge is gone, but the work is just beginning." Within days, it was clear. Sheriff Delaney wasn't retreating. He was rebuilding himself. And then, 1 week after the verdict, standing on the same courthouse steps where Amara had once declared her truth, Samuel Delaney announced his candidacy for mayor of Riverpoint. He didn't run as a politician. He ran as a man who had seen the limits of power, had watched it fail his own family, and now wanted to help reimagine what power could look like. "I'm not asking for a second chance," he said in his announcement speech. "I'm asking for your trust to help build something new. Not patched, not polished, but reimagined from the ground up." Riverpoint had never heard anything like it, and neither had the rest of the state. As the sheriff's office collapsed under the weight of years of unchecked power, something else rose in its place. Slowly, awkwardly, but undeniably real. Truth circles began forming in every corner of the community. Run by teachers, pastors, students, and elders, these gatherings weren't just about sharing stories. They were about hearing them. Victims of past police harassment came forward, many for the first time. Families whose complaints had been dismissed finally felt seen. One man spoke about being stopped 23 times in 6 months for fitting a description. A mother described how her son's confidence vanished after a single encounter with Officer Blevins 3 years earlier. They spoke not just of fear, but of shame. Shame they were made to carry for daring to exist visibly. Every meeting ended the same way. Not with outrage, but with action steps. Community members launched justice audits, combing through every policy and past case connected to Riverpoint's law enforcement. They created a digital database of dismissed complaints, tracking patterns of misconduct. The audit revealed what so many had long suspected: a system that didn't simply fail. It chose to look away. From the ashes of denial rose policy overhauls. The town council passed new measures: body cam requirements with third-party oversight, monthly public accountability sessions, trauma-informed training for all officers, and a civilian review board led by residents, not bureaucrats. And through it all, Amara Delaney moved like gravity, quiet but undeniable. She hadn't planned on being an activist, but the world kept calling, and she refused to ignore the echo. It started small, a Q&A at a college campus outside Atlanta, a podcast interview, a panel in Savannah on police reform. But word traveled fast, and her voice, a voice that didn't shake, didn't rage, but instead cut straight through the noise, resonated far beyond her hometown. By month 2, Amara was speaking at the Georgia State Capitol alongside civil rights leaders and policymakers. She testified before committees. She helped write language for statewide accountability legislation. She launched a nonprofit, Second Breath, focused on amplifying the voices of young people who had experienced police violence and providing them legal and emotional support. And yet, she always came home. Every Sunday, she walked the same river path where her life had nearly ended. The water moved differently now, not calmer, but clearer. She often said the river had taught her how to rise, not just physically, but spiritually, to come back with clarity, not vengeance. At a youth rally held in Riverpoint's community gym, a teenage girl asked her, "Do you ever wish it never happened?" Amara paused, thought carefully, then answered, "I wish no one had to go through what I did. I wish my name wasn't known because of violence, but I don't wish to go back. Because what's happening now, this awakening, this rebuilding, that came from the truth. And truth, once seen, can't be undone." The room stood and applauded, not because she was famous, but because she was theirs. A survivor who didn't just endure, but transformed. Meanwhile, Samuel Delaney's mayoral campaign was breaking records. Not because he was promising miracles, but because he wasn't. He stood on porches, sat at dinner tables, met with those who once blamed him and those who still did. He apologized. He listened. He promised not to protect what needed to be dismantled. His campaign slogan was simple: no more shadows. By autumn, national outlets had begun calling Riverpoint a case study in grassroots reform. Not a perfect model, but a living one. One born not from grant money or federal mandates, but from the courage of a girl who refused to drown in silence, and a town that finally chose to listen. The sheriff's office, once a symbol of quiet tyranny, now had new leadership, community liaisons, and an open-door policy for all public records. Amara's nonprofit had grown into a regional coalition. The justice audits expanded into neighboring towns, and Samuel Delaney was leading in the polls, not because he had avoided failure, but because he had faced it. Riverpoint wasn't healed, but it was healing. And for the first time in a long time, when people looked out at the river, they didn't just see a place where silence almost won. They saw a current that could carry them forward, if they were willing to wade through it together. 1 year later, Riverpoint did not look the same. The buildings still stood where they had always stood. Red brick courthouse, white clapboard church, the wide oak trees that shaded Main Street in the summer. But something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. It was in the way people greeted each other at the farmer's market, in the conversations overheard at school drop-offs, in the way silence no longer ruled the room when difficult truths were spoken. The town hadn't been rebuilt in steel or stone. It had been rebuilt in conscience. On a crisp June morning, the sun stretched lazily across the riverbank where it had all begun. Birds skimmed the water's surface, children laughed in the nearby park, and the river, once the scene of cruelty and suffocation, now flowed clear and slow, catching every shard of sunlight like glass turned to liquid. And there, walking the familiar dirt path in quiet rhythm, was Amara Delaney. Her steps were steady, her face calm. One hand held a folded paper program from the town's first day of civic memory, and the other brushed the tall grass swaying at the river's edge. She paused at a new bench facing the water, its bronze plaque etched with 15 words. "To those silenced by power, we hear you now. We rise with you. Behind her, a group of middle schoolers in matching blue t-shirts chattered around a tall woman in sunglasses. This is where it happened, the woman explained softly, gesturing toward the water. But that's not all it is anymore. That was the legacy. Not just remembering the pain, but transforming its place. The Riverpoint of 1 year ago had been paralyzed by fear, haunted by habit, unwilling to look itself in the mirror. But now, it breathed with something new. The reckoning sparked by Amara's near drowning had rippled outward in waves. First panic, then protest, then policy, and finally, purpose. At the heart of the change were the youth advisory councils, created just 4 months after the trial. Made up of high school and college students from every ward, they reviewed police practices, proposed community events, and even helped write new guidelines for de-escalation training. No policy passed without their input. Their voices weren't symbolic. They were central. Every month, 2 students from the council sat face-to-face with the Riverpoint Police Board. Not as guests, but as equal participants. They wore suits and sneakers, brought binders filled with research, and asked hard questions like, "What's being done to prevent racial profiling in traffic stops? Why are we funding riot gear but not trauma training?" And the board had to answer. Some of the older officers resisted at first. They rolled their eyes, mumbled idealists under their breath. But slowly, deliberately, the old guard realized that listening to youth wasn't a threat. It was a blueprint for survival. Across town, public spaces had begun to tell new stories. The once barren wall outside the courthouse now held a vibrant mural painted by local artists and students. A swirling landscape of raised hands, blooming flowers, river water, and Amara's silhouette at the center, not as a victim, but as a flame. Below it, visitors could read the words, "Truth is not what breaks us, it's what begins us." The Riverpoint Library had transformed one room into a permanent civic archive. Inside were the old complaint records once buried in cabinets, copies of court documents, video testimonies from community members, and a digital timeline mapping the town's transformation. Tour groups came weekly, teachers, activists, government workers, and students from neighboring counties who wanted to learn what healing looked like when a community chose truth over tradition. And still, through it all, Amara remained present, but never performative. She declined speaking tours that would take her away for months at a time. Instead, she built local. She held monthly workshops with young girls on power and identity. She worked with lawyers to develop simplified Know Your Rights materials for teens and parents. Her nonprofit, Second Breath, grew into a full-time operation with branches across Georgia. But Riverpoint always stayed home. When asked in an interview why she hadn't moved to a bigger city, she replied simply, "Because change isn't about where the lights are brightest. It's about where the silence once lived." And in the silence that once ruled Riverpoint, something sacred had bloomed. Old rivals now sat on joint committees. Pastors shared pulpits. Police captains stood beside high school activists at rallies. Justice was no longer whispered behind closed doors. It was spoken in boardrooms, classrooms, and backyard barbecues. Even Sheriff-turned-Mayor Samuel Delaney had become a different kind of leader. He didn't hide behind security or polish. He held open forums under the same oak trees that once shaded angry crowds. He invited criticism, apologized in public, listened without flinching. And it worked. Under his leadership, Riverpoint's crime reporting improved. Civilian complaints dropped. Community satisfaction rose. The town didn't erase its past, it learned from it. Every policy was marked by the fingerprints of a community that now insisted on being seen. As Amara continued her walk that morning, she passed the newly renovated community center, now renamed the Delaney Civic Commons, not after her father, but her mother, Lorraine, whose quiet determination had steered the town through its darkest storm. Out front, a sculpture stood, cast in iron and glass. It depicted a hand reaching upward from water, not in panic, but in strength. Around its base were the names of victims from Riverpoint's past, those who had been overlooked, dismissed, forgotten. At the top, one name stood in bold: Amara Delaney, witness, survivor, catalyst. She paused there, alone. The sun warmed her skin. A breeze rolled across the grass. For a moment, she closed her eyes and listened to the wind, to the birds, to the soft rush of the river. It didn't sound like the scene of her trauma anymore. It sounded like peace. Earned peace. A little girl on a bicycle rolled by and waved. "Hi, Miss Amara." Amara smiled. "Hey there, Braveheart." Because bravery had never been about noise or anger. For Amara, it had always been about standing when it hurt, speaking when her voice trembled, staying when it would have been easier to leave. She kept walking, the river now beside her, not against her. A quiet current moved in time with her stride, reflecting not the memory of that day, but the future she helped write. 1 year ago, they tried to silence her. Today, the town moved to the rhythm of her voice, and it would never go quiet again. 1 year ago, Amara Delaney was held underwater for 39 seconds, not because she committed a crime, but because 2 officers saw a threat instead of a person. That act of violence could have ended in silence, like so many others. But Amara survived. She stood up. She spoke truth into a courtroom, a community, and a country that had long learned to look away. Her courage cracked open a system, and in the year that followed, Riverpoint transformed. Youth led policy, families led reform, a sheriff became a mayor. And the river that once tried to swallow her now reflects justice instead of power. But this story doesn't belong only to Riverpoint. It belongs to every town in America. Because the conditions that nearly drowned Amara exist in your city, your schools, your systems. So here's what we, as American citizens, must do. Listen when the truth is hard. Speak when the silence is easy. Show up even when it's uncomfortable. Reform does not come wrapped in slogans. It comes in uncomfortable conversations, school board meetings, town halls, budget hearings, and holding power to account at every level. We can't wait for another video to go viral. We must become the evidence of the change we want to see. Start where you are. Join a community group. Learn your local laws. Ask your police department about their oversight. Talk to your neighbors. Don't assume someone else will speak. Be the someone. Amara didn't want to be a symbol. She wanted to survive. But her survival gave rise to a movement, a mirror, and a map. And now, it's up to us to carry it forward. If her story moved you, if you saw something of your community in hers, don't let it end when this video does. Share it. Talk about it. Use it. Post it in your group chat. Bring it to your classroom. Send it to your local representative. And if you believe in stories that challenge power and amplify courage, subscribe to this channel, like the video, and help keep this truth alive. Because Amara's story is not just a reminder of what nearly happened. It's proof of what can happen when we refuse to stay silent. One story, 1 year, 1 river, and a future still being written by people like you.